Hello, today I'd like to demonstrate how I like to use raised enamel on my ornaments to accent my scroll work. And you can see on this particular ornament, I did some scrolling with my China paints, and now I want to go back and accent those scrolls with some raised enamel. Now the raised relief powder that I like to use, and this is the relief that I sell in my shop, I'll put a link to it down below, but I use my regular painting medium, which is a drying oil, to mix it with, and it comes in a powder form. And this is the only raised enamel that I use because the great thing about this one is it's pretty whether you cover it with gold or not. It fires a little bit translucent the hotter that you fire it. It's easy to mix. I just use my regular painting medium, my drying medium that I normally use. So I don't have to have anything special for it. And it hasn't popped off or given me any trouble. So I just mix it up to the proper consistency with my painting medium. And the consistency is really kind of the key. And just like with your paints, you want to grind it into your tile and make sure that you get all of the grit, all of those little pieces and fragments and lumpy bumpies out. So we're just going to grind this up. And really, the consistency is what's going to be key. The thinner it is, the easier it is to do scroll work and to get it to string. And I'm going to show you what I mean by stringing. But unfortunately, when we get it real thin and it's super easy to make it string, it's also too thin and it spreads out on the porcelain and then it becomes flat. Or it kind of all runs together and you don't have a defined shape for your scrolls. So there's kind of a happy medium. If it's too thick, then it won't string at all, or it becomes sharp and leaves pointy edges and sharp points, and you don't want that. But it does stay nice and high, but unfortunately it becomes sharp. So we don't want that. We want it to string, but we don't want it to be so thin that it runs all over the place or that it becomes flat. So what I've found is the consistency that I like to use when I lift my knife up or lift my brush up through the pile of the enamel, it looks like a soft serve ice cream cone, like the tip. So you're going to see me, I'm going to show you here how it strings a little bit off of the palette knife. But when I lift my palette knife up, see how it's flipping over on top, kind of like a soft serve ice cream cone. And that's how I know that it's the right consistency that I want to use. So you just mix your base up with your painting medium, get it nice and smooth, and put a nice little pile here to work from. And to do my raised enamel scroll work, I like to use a nice small scroller, and I'm going to be using a 20/0 scroller, and this is a synthetic sable. It's actually a synthetic brush, but a sable brush would work great. I just get a little bit of oil in there to oil my brush, and I'm going to blot that oil out. Now to fill the brush, to start doing my scroll work, I'm just going to kind of stick it into the pile and move it in a circular motion and then lift straight up. And you're going to see there's going to be a dollop of the enamel kind of hanging off of my brush. And when I go to do my scroll work, I'm going to touch that down onto the china and follow the edge of that scroll just to put a little comma-shaped accent on there. And as I go, I'm going to lift up so that it gets thinner as I go. But I'm not really putting any pressure, doing a stroke or anything on the china. It's not like painting. Because if I put pressure, I'm going to deform that nice, even top of that scroll. I'm going to put a brush mark through it, and it's going to have brush marks, and it's not going to be a nice, smooth, enameled scroll. So it's kind of like draping. You're just kind of draping the enamel onto the china. You're letting it flow right off of the brush, and you're just kind of guiding it into the shape. And it takes practice. But if you make a mistake, just get your soft cloth and just a little denatured alcohol or some acetone and just wipe it right off, and you can start again. But I just go through making my little comma shapes to follow and accent my scrolls. And I use just a real soft amount of pressure. And the hardest part of this, once you get the consistency right, the hardest part of this is actually keeping your hand out of it. Believe it or not, that's the biggest trouble that I have, is as I go through, I will stick my fingers in it while I'm trying to go along and get this done. That's the biggest frustration that I've had. If I could just figure out how to levitate the piece and work on it without having to hold it, that would be great. But somehow I don't think that's going to happen. But all kidding aside, you can see that you need to reload your brush for every stroke because we need to have that bit of enamel hanging off of the end to properly drape it onto the porcelain. So this can be rather time consuming, but in my opinion it's well worth it. Once it's fired, this really adds quite a bit to the piece. Now some folks, they may like to use a needle instead of a brush to apply their raised accents, and use whatever you're comfortable with. Me personally, I prefer a brush, so that's what I've always used. And depending upon the size of the accents that I want to do, it will determine the size of the brush that I'm using. This is a small piece, a Christmas ornament, and so I'm sticking with my super small scroller brush. But if I were doing a large keepsake box or something, I might go ahead and use a larger brush to make my accents because the scrolls themselves would be larger. Now, once this is done, you're going to let the enamel sit up for a few hours before you would want to fire this. And so I would just go ahead and stick it into the kiln or put something over top of it to keep the dust and the dirt off of it until I was able to fire it. And while you're working, if you notice that the enamel starts to get too stiff on you, then you can either oil your brush up a little bit, or just take your palette knife and add a little extra oil into the enamel and mix it up again. If you start to see that it's drying on you or starting to get too stiff, then just give it a good mix and maybe add a tiny bit of oil. And if it starts to dry out in your brush, then just clean your brush out in some oil and start fresh with a clean brush. Now, as you're going along, you want to make sure that your accents, your scrolls, aren't necessarily touching each other because we don't want them to grow together when we fire. You can see here I've made a mistake. These two scrolls are touching each other. And I don't necessarily have to wipe this off in order to fix it. Now this is a round brush, and it's a synthetic brush, and it has a nice point to it, so you want to use a round brush with a good point. But I'm just going to put a little oil in this brush and blot it out, and the oil is really just to keep the brush hairs together to hold that nice point. I don't want to add extra oil to my enamel. But I'm just going to go in here and I'm going to wipe through and separate these two accents. You can see that the brush will pick up a little bit of the enamel off of the piece. And I can use this brush to go along the edges of my accents and shape them up or change their shape or spread them out. Just like with China paint, we can move the enamel on the piece and reshape it. So if you don't like the shape of something or you've made a mistake, you don't necessarily have to wipe it off. You can use your round brush and get in there and coax it and give it a shove and remove a little here and there until you like the way it looks. But keep in mind, until you fire this enamel, it's not permanent. You can make any changes or wipe it off. You don't have to worry about damaging your piece or anything like that. You can just wipe it right off. This enamel will fire a beautiful translucent white, and the hotter you fire it, the more translucent it will become. I usually fire mine between cone 018 and 016, depending upon what I'm using it for. Now on a subsequent fire, you can go ahead and cover that with any gold. You aren't limited to Roman gold or liquid bright gold. You could use either one, or liquid bright platinum, or you could use any luster over it. Mother of pearl over top of the enamel accents is actually quite pretty. And if you didn't want white enamel, Keep in mind that you can mix your powdered china paints in with this and change the color. I'm also going to add a few dots of the enamel on this piece. And the way you want to do your dots, again, start with that little bit of a dollop of enamel hanging off of your brush. And you're just going to set your brush down and then pull straight up. And you want to make sure that if it starts to string on you, that when the string breaks, that it goes back into the dot and sinks down into the dot and doesn't stick up like a point coming out of the dot, because when you fire that point, it's going to be sharp like a little needle and it can actually cut someone. You always want to make sure everything is nice and smooth and that there aren't ridges or spikes sticking up out of your dots. What you see is what you're going to get. If there's something sticking up or if it's ridged before you fire it, it's going to stay that way and be sharp after it's fired. One way to achieve this is to move your brush in a circular motion if it starts to string, and it'll break that string, and the string should sink down and disappear into the dot. I hope this demo was helpful. If you have any questions, you can leave them below or drop me a line. See you next time.